At precisely 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, Colonel Victor Langford raised his clenched fist toward Captain Elise Moreau in front of 282 international NATO recruits. What happened in the next 3 seconds would trigger the biggest military scandal Fort Braddock had witnessed in 30 years, expose a network of corruption spanning multiple countries, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the room isn't the one you expect. But this story isn't about a fight. It's about a woman who spent 3 years living a lie, watching good soldiers suffer in silence, and waiting for the perfect moment to bring down an empire built on fear. Because what those 282 recruits didn't know was that Captain Moreau wasn't really a logistics coordinator. She wasn't even supposed to be there. Before we dive into the secrets that nearly cost Elise everything, I want to hear from you. Have you ever watched someone abuse their power and wished you could do something about it? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this story proves that courage doesn't always come with a cape. And if stories like these inspire you to believe that one person can change everything, hitting that thanks button helps us bring more of these incredible untold stories to light. Your support means we can keep shining a spotlight on the heroes who refuse to stay silent when it matters most. What you're about to discover involves classified documents that only surfaced during a Pentagon investigation, security footage that 3 governments tried to suppress, and testimony from witnesses across 12 NATO countries. This is the story of how one perfectly executed judo throw didn't just put a colonel on his back, it brought down a system that had been protecting predators for decades. Fort Braddock stretched across 8,000 acres of Pennsylvania wilderness. Its gray concrete buildings and razor wire fencing housing one of NATO's most prestigious joint training programs. For 6 weeks every summer, elite military personnel from allied nations gathered here to forge the future of international cooperation. The facility buzzed with languages, accents, and the constant rhythm of boots on asphalt. But beneath the surface of this diplomatic showcase, something rotten had been growing unchecked for years. Captain Elise Moreau arrived on a humid Monday morning in June, her personnel file marking her as a logistics coordinator from the Army's European Command. She was 31, compact but athletic, with sharp green eyes that seemed to catalog everything without judgment. Her uniform was pressed to perfection. Her boots gleamed despite the morning dew, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place through merit, not politics. What made her unusual wasn't her competence, though she had plenty of that. It was her habit of arriving 30 minutes before everyone else, her tendency to sit facing the door in any room, and the way she unconsciously flexed her left hand whenever someone mentioned combat deployments. Most telling was the small scar that ran along her knuckles, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. Fort Braddock's standard protocol required all NATO joint exercises to be documented using military-grade recording systems, professional camera equipment with encrypted storage capabilities that could withstand extreme field conditions and provide crystal-clear footage for post-mission analysis. These systems captured everything from training scenarios to briefing sessions, creating an unalterable record of events that would later prove crucial in ways no one anticipated. Her assigned quarters were spartanly furnished, the walls decorated only with regulation items, and a single framed photograph tucked discreetly on her nightstand. The image showed 5 soldiers in desert camouflage, their faces obscured by shadows and protective gear. Anyone glancing at it would assume it was a standard deployment photo. But the careful observer might notice that one figure wore gear that didn't match standard issue equipment that suggested specialized training far beyond normal infantry work. Colonel Victor Langford had ruled Fort Braddock for 4 years with an iron fist wrapped in diplomatic courtesy. At 53, he was everything the military loved to showcase. Decorated Gulf War veteran, recipient of the Bronze Star, fluent in 3 languages, and possessing the kind of commanding presence that made generals nod approvingly during inspection tours. His record was spotless, his efficiency ratings exceptional, and his ability to produce results unquestioned. What the official records didn't capture was the tremor in junior officers' voices when they briefed him, the way female personnel avoided being alone in his presence, or the unusual number of transfer requests that emerged from Fort Braddock every training cycle. Langford had mastered the art of operating in shadows while maintaining a gleaming public image. His office walls displayed a museum's worth of military memorabilia, unit patches from 6 different assignments, photographs with high-ranking officials from multiple countries, and citations that traced a career built on tactical brilliance and ruthless ambition. Hidden among these trophies was evidence of the man behind the legend: prescription bottles with labels torn off, a desktop calendar with aggressive red marks through dates, and a framed wedding photo turned face down in his desk drawer. The current training cycle brought together personnel from 12 NATO countries for Exercise Iron Unity, a 6-week program designed to test international cooperation under extreme stress. The participating units included British SAS instructors, German Bundes specialists, French Foreign Legion advisors, and elite forces from smaller allied nations. The exercise was considered a diplomatic triumph, a showcase of Western military cooperation that would be studied and analyzed for years to come. What made this cycle particularly sensitive was the presence of embedded observers from the Pentagon and Brussels, military journalists documenting the cooperation for promotional purposes, and a classified assessment team evaluating whether Fort Braddock deserved expansion funding. Every decision, every interaction, every success or failure would be scrutinized by people with the power to shape military policy across the Atlantic Alliance. Elise's first day revealed the complex social dynamics that govern life at Fort Braddock. During the morning briefing, she watched as Langford addressed the assembled international officers with polished charm, his voice carrying just enough authority to remind everyone who was in charge while maintaining the pretense of collaborative leadership. His jokes landed perfectly, his tactical insights were delivered with confidence, and his presence commanded the room without apparent effort. But she also noticed smaller details that others missed. The way Lieutenant Clara Fitzgerald from the British contingent kept her arms crossed offensively throughout the briefing. How Major Lucas Brandt from Germany avoided making direct eye contact with Langford after a seemingly innocent comment about European military standards. The tension that rippled through the room when Langford made an offhand remark about female officers needing extra protection during field exercises. These weren't random observations. Elise had been trained to read room dynamics, to identify power structures and stress patterns, to catalog the subtle signs that indicated when authority was being abused. Her real mission at Fort Braddock had nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with investigation. 3 months earlier, a classified report had reached the Pentagon detailing unusual patterns in NATO joint training programs. Transfer requests from female officers had spiked dramatically at certain facilities. Complaint procedures were being completed but mysteriously stalled in bureaucratic review. Most disturbing were the exit interviews conducted by military investigators, which revealed a consistent pattern of harassment, intimidation, and career sabotage at installations commanded by a specific type of officer. Fort Braddock had appeared on every problematic list. The decision to send an undercover investigator was unprecedented in NATO cooperation protocols. It required authorization from the Secretary of Defense, coordination with Allied intelligence services, and the creation of an elaborate false identity that would withstand scrutiny from some of the most security-conscious military professionals in the world. Elise's real name was Captain Elise Moreau, but her real rank was Major, and her real specialty was criminal investigation with the Army's Criminal Investigation Command. Her personnel file had been carefully sanitized, her deployment history modified, and her specialized training records classified at levels that even NATO command couldn't access without specific authorization codes. What the file didn't reveal was Elise's completion of elite specialized training programs, classified courses originally developed for executive protection but adapted for special operations, combining advanced legal protocols with combat psychology that only top-tier militaries offered to selected personnel. These programs had prepared her not just for investigation work, but for the kind of dangerous situations that arose when powerful people realized they were being watched. Her assignment was elegantly simple and terrifyingly complex. Integrate into Fort Braddock's structure, document any misconduct, identify the scope of potential problems, and build a case that would either clear the facility or justify a complete restructuring of NATO training protocols. She had 6 weeks to accomplish what traditional oversight had failed to achieve in 4 years. The challenge was maintaining her cover while gathering evidence against someone who had made a career of avoiding accountability. Langford wasn't stupid, and he had survived multiple informal inquiries by being careful, subtle, and absolutely ruthless with anyone who threatened his position. But Elise had advantages he didn't expect. Her background included 3 combat deployments that weren't mentioned in her cover identity, hand-to-hand combat training that exceeded anything taught to regular officers, and a talent for reading people that had been honed through years of investigating crimes within the military's closed community. More importantly, she understood that predators like Langford operated through intimidation and isolation. They picked targets who seemed vulnerable, who lacked support networks, who could be discredited if they spoke up. What they rarely anticipated was encountering someone who had spent years learning how to appear vulnerable while being anything but. The first incident occurred on her 3rd day at Fort Braddock. During a tactical planning session for the week's field exercises, Elise identified a significant flaw in Langford's proposed troop movements. The route he had selected would create a dangerous bottleneck during simulated combat scenarios, potentially causing injuries if the exercise proceeded as planned. Following proper protocol, she submitted her concerns through the chain of command, providing detailed analysis and alternative suggestions. Her report was thorough, professional, and potentially life-saving. It was also exactly the kind of initiative that Langford viewed as a threat to his authority. His response came during the afternoon briefing in front of 40 international officers. Without naming her directly, he announced that some personnel seemed to be confusing their advisory roles with command responsibilities, and that overthinking simple tactical problems was a common mistake among officers who lacked real combat experience. The message was clear to everyone in the room. Captain Moreau had overstepped her bounds and was being publicly corrected. For most observers, it appeared to be standard military discipline. For Elise, it was confirmation that she had found her target. What she didn't expect was the reaction from other personnel. After the briefing, Lieutenant Fitzgerald approached her quietly, suggesting they discuss logistical coordination over coffee. During their conversation in the mess hall, Fitzgerald's carefully neutral questions revealed something significant. This wasn't the first time someone had identified problems with Langford tactical decisions, and it wasn't the first time the messenger had been shot down publicly. 2 days later, Elise discovered that her tactical analysis had been correct. During the field exercise, exactly the bottleneck she had predicted occurred, resulting in a training accident that left one German sergeant with a sprained ankle and created the kind of diplomatic incident that NATO exercises were designed to avoid. The accident report, however, attributed the problem to unclear communications and trainee error, making no mention of the tactical flaw she had identified. That evening, an anonymous note appeared under her door. "Be careful. You're being watched more closely than you think." The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the warning was clear. Someone else at Fort Braddock was paying attention to the dynamics between her and Langford, and that someone was concerned enough to take a risk in contacting her. Elise's investigation began to reveal patterns that were both subtle and systematic. Langford had perfected the art of maintaining plausible deniability while creating a climate of fear and intimidation. He never made direct threats, but his tactical decisions consistently put certain officers in positions where failure was likely. He never explicitly discriminated, but female personnel found their suggestions dismissed more frequently and their mistakes remembered longer. Most insidiously, he had created a culture where reporting problems was subtly discouraged through a combination of bureaucratic obstacles and social pressure. Complaints required extensive documentation, multiple interviews and review processes that could stretch for months, while the complainant remained in close proximity to the person they were accusing. The few officers who had filed formal complaints found themselves facing sudden changes in assignment, unexpected negative performance reviews, or recommendations for additional training that effectively sidelined them from prestigious positions. None of these actions was explicitly retaliatory, but the pattern was unmistakable to anyone looking for it. Elise's second week at Fort Braddock brought new challenges as Exercise Iron Unity moved into its more intensive phases. The training scenarios became more complex, involving multiple units operating under simulated combat conditions across Fort Braddock's extensive training grounds. The pressure increased on everyone, but particularly on the international officers who were being evaluated not just on their individual performance, but on their ability to integrate with allied forces. It was during this period that Langford's true nature began to emerge more clearly. The diplomatic veneer that he maintained during formal briefings gave way to a more aggressive management style when he believed he was operating without oversight. Elise documented instances of verbal abuse disguised as motivation, tactical decisions that seemed designed to embarrass specific officers, and a pattern of behavior that suggested someone who enjoyed exercising power over others. The turning point came during a night training exercise that went wrong in ways that had nothing to do with the planned scenarios. The night exercise was supposed to be routine. 3 international units working together to secure a mock facility while dealing with simulated casualties and equipment failures. But when Sergeant Fritz Neumann from the German contingent triggered what should have been a harmless smoke grenade, the device malfunctioned catastrophically. Instead of producing colored smoke, it released a cloud of acrid chemical vapor that sent 6 soldiers to the medical facility with respiratory problems. Elise was the first to recognize the danger. Her training kicked in immediately as she ordered an emergency evacuation of the area, coordinated medical response, and implemented containment protocols that prevented what could have been a diplomatic disaster. Her quick thinking saved lives and careers, but it also did something else. It made Colonel Langford look incompetent in front of observers from 3 governments. The official after-action report praised her swift response and recommended her for commendation, but in the corridors of Fort Braddock, a different story was taking shape. Langford began suggesting that Captain Moreau had overreacted to a minor equipment malfunction, that her response had created more problems than it solved, and that female officers often struggled with proportional decision-making under pressure. The whisper campaign was subtle but effective. Within 48 hours, other officers were questioning whether Elise's dramatic response had been necessary or whether she had been grandstanding for the international observers. The narrative shifted from heroic quick thinking to attention-seeking behavior, and Langford didn't have to say a word directly. But Elise had been documenting everything, every conversation, every slight, every instance where protocol was bent to serve personal agendas. Her real training included advanced surveillance techniques and evidence-gathering methods that transformed seemingly casual interactions into detailed intelligence reports. She was building a case that would eventually reach desks in Washington and Brussels. But first, she needed to survive long enough to complete her mission. The pressure continued to build throughout her 3rd week at Fort Braddock. Langford seemed to take personal pleasure in finding new ways to undermine her authority while maintaining his facade of professional leadership. He assigned her to work details that were deliberately beneath her stated rank and experience. He excluded her from planning sessions where her expertise would have been valuable. Most dangerously, he began to isolate her from potential allies among the international personnel. The isolation wasn't accidental. Predators like Langford understood that their victims were most vulnerable when they lacked support networks and witnesses. By systematically cutting Elise off from collegial relationships, he was preparing the ground for something more direct and personal. During her 4th week, strange things began happening to Elise's equipment and quarters. Her computer experienced mysterious malfunctions that wiped important files. Her assigned vehicle developed mechanical problems that stranded her in remote training areas. Most troubling, her secure communications equipment failed during critical coordination tasks, forcing her to rely on standard channels that could be monitored by anyone with the right access codes. These weren't random equipment failures. Someone was systematically sabotaging her ability to do her job while creating plausible cover stories that made her appear incompetent or unlucky. The message was clear. You're isolated, you're vulnerable, and you need to understand your place in the hierarchy. But Langford had underestimated both her training and her mission. While he was focused on psychological intimidation, Elise was uncovering evidence of crimes that went far beyond harassment or abuse of authority. Her investigation had revealed systematic equipment theft, falsified maintenance records, and financial discrepancies that suggested organized criminal activity rather than simple corruption. The breakthrough came when she discovered that Fort Braddock's supply chain management was being manipulated through sophisticated financial tracking systems. Originally designed for high-stakes international trading operations, but adapted for military logistics to monitor resource allocation across multiple allied nations and identify patterns of systematic theft that traditional auditing methods consistently missed. The evidence was damning. Someone had been selling military equipment to private contractors and covering the losses through creative accounting that exploited the complexity of NATO cost-sharing agreements. Night vision equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, communications gear containing classified technology, weapons, and ammunition that could outfit a small mercenary force, all systematically stolen and sold through networks that reached into civilian criminal organizations. More importantly, the authorization signatures revealed that this wasn't a one-person operation. Multiple officers were involved, creating a network of corruption that explained why complaints about Fort Braddock had been so systematically buried. The facility wasn't just harboring a harassment problem, it was the center of an international military equipment theft ring. But her discovery also meant that she was now investigating people who had committed crimes serious enough to warrant decades in military prison. And criminals with that much to lose wouldn't hesitate to eliminate threats to their operation. The confrontation she had been expecting finally materialized during the 5th week of Exercise Iron Unity. Langford appeared in her quarters one evening without authorization. His usual professional demeanor replaced by barely controlled aggression. His uniform was rumpled, his eyes bloodshot, and there was a desperation in his manner that suggested someone operating under extreme pressure. Their conversation started with accusations about her equipment reports raising unnecessary questions with supply chain auditors. But it quickly escalated as Langford revealed how much he knew about her background and how little he cared about the consequences of dealing with her directly. He had discovered that Captain Moreau's personnel file contained inconsistencies that suggested she wasn't who she claimed to be. The threat was explicit enough to constitute assault under military law, but it was delivered in private with no witnesses and no recording equipment. It was exactly the kind of situation that Langford had created dozens of times before with other officers who had threatened his operation. What he didn't anticipate was that this time, his victim was prepared for violence. The setup for the final confrontation came 3 days later, during what was supposed to be the culminating ceremony of Exercise Iron Unity. All 282 international personnel were assembled on Fort Braddock's main parade ground for closing remarks and recognition ceremonies. Representatives from 12 NATO countries filled the reviewing stands. Cameras documented everything for historical records, and senior officers from multiple allied nations prepared to deliver speeches about international cooperation and shared military values. The ceremony was a showcase of military precision and diplomatic cooperation. Flags from 12 nations snapped in the morning breeze. Bands played anthems that represented the best traditions of the Atlantic Alliance, and hundreds of elite military personnel demonstrated the kind of unity that NATO's founders had envisioned decades earlier. But beneath the pageantry, tension crackled like electricity before a storm. Elise stood in formation with her assigned unit, maintaining perfect military bearing while mentally preparing for what she knew was coming. Langford had been watching her throughout the ceremony with an intensity that suggested final desperation, and she understood that he viewed this public gathering as his last opportunity to deal with her before Exercise Iron Unity concluded, and she returned to her supposed assignment in Europe. The moment came during what appeared to be a routine inspection. Langford approached her position in formation, ostensibly to deliver final instructions or conduct a standard equipment check. To outside observers, it looked like normal military protocol. The reality was that he was making one final attempt to intimidate her into silence. His words were delivered quietly enough that nearby personnel couldn't hear the specific content, but his body language was unmistakably aggressive. He moved into her personal space, used his height advantage to loom over her, and made verbal threats that constituted assault under military law. When she refused to acknowledge his demands or agree to bury her investigation, he escalated to physical intimidation. The moment he raised his hand, everything that had been building for 5 weeks exploded into action. Elise's reaction was instantaneous and precise. Her left hand intercepted his wrist before the strike could land. Her right hand gripped his elbow, and she executed a textbook Hare-Goshi hip throw that sent his 210-pound frame spinning through the air before depositing him flat on his back on the parade ground asphalt. The sound of impact echoed across the formation like a gunshot. 282 international military personnel stood frozen in shocked silence as their commanding officer lay gasping and motionless in front of a captain who had just violated every protocol governing military discipline and chain of command. Except that she hadn't. Standing over Langford with her posture still controlled and professional, Elise spoke loudly enough for the formation to hear. "Sir, You attempted to strike a fellow officer during an official ceremony. I defended myself using minimum necessary force as authorized under military law and NATO engagement protocols. Then she did something that revealed her true identity to anyone paying close attention. She recited the exact military regulation numbers that govern self-defense in joint operations, quoted the specific subsections that apply to preventing assault by superior officers, and referenced international agreements that protected military personnel from abuse, regardless of rank or nationality. Only someone with extensive legal training would have that level of detailed knowledge immediately available under stress. Only someone with investigative authority would have the confidence to cite regulations that most officers barely understood. And only someone with special operations background would have possessed the physical skills to execute a perfect defensive throw against a larger opponent without causing permanent injury. The parade ground remained silent for nearly 30 seconds before the senior NATO observer, General Sophia Leclerc from the Canadian Armed Forces, stepped forward to take control of the situation. Her first question wasn't about the physical altercation. It was about Captain Moreau's actual identity and authorization to be at Fort Braddock. Elisa's response transformed everything everyone thought they knew about the previous 5 weeks. She wasn't Captain Elise Moreau from European Command Logistics. She was Major Elise Moreau from Army Criminal Investigation Command, operating under classified authorization from the Secretary of Defense and NATO intelligence coordination protocols. Her mission hadn't been to coordinate supply chains. It had been to investigate systematic corruption and abuse that had been reported through multiple channels, but never properly addressed through normal oversight procedures. And the evidence she had gathered over 5 weeks was sufficient to justify immediate criminal charges against Colonel Langford and 6 other officers operating an international military equipment theft ring that had been stealing and selling NATO resources for over 3 years. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled personnel and observers. Military police units that had been positioned discreetly around the ceremony moved forward to secure potential evidence and witnesses. Communication specialists began implementing security protocols to prevent the destruction of records. Most importantly, the international observers who had come to Fort Braddock to evaluate NATO cooperation found themselves witnessing the exposure of the biggest military corruption scandal in the alliance's recent history. The investigation that followed was swift and comprehensive. Within 72 hours, military investigators from 4 countries had arrived at Fort Braddock with search warrants, seizure orders, honest and arrest authorizations that covered the entire command structure. The equipment theft ring was larger and more sophisticated than anyone had imagined, involving personnel at 7 different NATO facilities and private contractors in multiple countries. Langford himself faced charges including assault, theft of military property, conspiracy, abuse of authority, and violation of international military cooperation agreements. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including the detailed documentation that Elise had gathered and financial records that revealed millions of dollars in stolen equipment had been sold through networks that reached into civilian criminal organizations. But the criminal charges were almost secondary to the institutional earthquake that followed. The corruption at Fort Braddock hadn't existed in isolation. It was part of a network that had compromised military readiness and international security across multiple allied nations. Equipment that should have been protecting soldiers in combat zones had been sold to private military contractors, arms dealers, and criminal organizations. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Communications equipment containing classified encryption technology had been sold to buyers whose identities remained unknown. Night vision systems designed for special operations had ended up in the hands of mercenary groups operating in conflict zones. Weapons and ammunition that should have been securing democratic nations had been diverted to black markets that supplied insurgent groups and criminal cartels. NATO implemented immediate reforms to prevent similar corruption in the future. New oversight protocols for joint training exercises were established with independent monitoring that couldn't be compromised by local command structures. International reporting mechanisms were created to allow personnel from any member nation to report misconduct without going through potentially compromised chains of command. Most importantly, investigative procedures were restructured to include the kind of undercover operations that had exposed the Fort Braddock network. Major Moreau's success had proven that traditional oversight methods were insufficient to detect sophisticated criminal operations and that protecting military integrity required more aggressive and innovative approaches. The 282 personnel who witnessed the confrontation became advocates for military justice reform in their home countries. They carried the story of what they had seen back to bases across Europe and North America, spreading awareness of how systematic abuse could be hidden behind military courtesy and international cooperation protocols. Their testimony during subsequent investigations revealed that warning signs had been present for years, but that cultural factors and institutional protections had prevented effective action. Female officers had been transferring out of Fort Braddock at unusual rates, but their exit interviews had been sanitized and to avoid diplomatic complications. Equipment discrepancies had been noted in multiple reports, but the complexity of international cost-sharing had made it easy to hide systematic theft behind bureaucratic confusion. More importantly, they had seen proof that standing up to corruption was possible, even when it seemed like the entire system was designed to protect predators and silence victims. Major Elise Moreau became a symbol of something that military culture desperately needed: the courage to do what was right, regardless of rank, politics, or personal cost. 6 months later, Victor Langford was serving a 20-year sentence in military prison, his career and reputation destroyed by the evidence that Elise had gathered during her 5 weeks undercover at Fort Braddock. The equipment theft ring had been completely dismantled, with prosecutions extending into civilian courts in multiple countries as investigators traced the networks that had been purchasing stolen military equipment. Fort Braddock itself had been restructured under new command with enhanced oversight and transparency requirements. The facility that had once been a showcase of NATO cooperation had become a symbol of the institutional vigilance required to maintain military integrity in an interconnected world. And Major Moreau had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to lead a new NATO task force for investigating military misconduct, armed with expanded authority and resources to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had flourished under Victor Langford's command. The 3-second judo throw that ended Langford's career had sent ripples through military institutions across the Atlantic Alliance. It proved that sometimes justice doesn't come through proper channels or bureaucratic processes. Sometimes it comes from one person refusing to accept that abuse is inevitable, corruption is unstoppable, or that powerful people are beyond accountability. Within weeks of the incident, militaries across NATO countries began incorporating new case studies into their leadership curricula. The Fort Braddock affair became required reading for officer training programs, not just as an example of corruption exposed, but as a demonstration of how institutional failures could be prevented through individual courage and systematic investigation. The photograph on Elise's nightstand, the one showing 5 soldiers in desert camouflage with faces obscured by shadows, had been taken during her first special operations deployment in Afghanistan. She was the figure whose equipment didn't match standard issue, the one whose specialized training had prepared her for exactly the kind of mission she had completed at Fort Braddock. 2 of those soldiers in the photograph had died protecting an intelligence asset who later provided information that saved hundreds of civilian lives. Their sacrifice had taught her that some battles are worth fighting regardless of personal cost. The ripple effects continued, expanding months after the ceremony. Female officers who had suffered in silence for years began filing reports, knowing that the system had finally proven it could protect whistleblowers. Male officers who had witnessed misconduct but felt powerless to act discovered that speaking up was not career suicide, but career responsibility. The culture of silence that had protected predators for decades began cracking under the weight of accountability. International military cooperation took on new meaning as allied nations realized that corruption in one facility could compromise security across multiple countries. The equipment that Langford Network had stolen wasn't just property. It represented shared trust, collective defense capabilities, and the lives of soldiers who depended on that equipment to survive combat operations. But the real victory wasn't the exposure of one corrupt officer or even the dismantling of an international theft ring. It was the demonstration that military culture could police itself when given the tools and courage to confront uncomfortable truths. The investigation revealed that many personnel had suspected problems but lacked mechanisms to report them safely or effectively. New protocols emerged from the lessons learned at Fort Braddock: anonymous reporting systems that bypassed local command structures, international oversight bodies with real investigative authority, and career protection programs for personnel who exposed misconduct, these weren't just policy changes. They were cultural transformations that redefined what it meant to serve with honor. The 282 witnesses spread throughout NATO countries, carrying with them the knowledge that change was possible. They became advocates in their home units, training officers who had never heard of Fort Braddock, but who inherited the legacy of accountability that emerged from that parade ground confrontation. Sometimes, change arrives in the form of a perfectly executed hip throw that puts the whole rotten system flat on its back and gasping for air. Sometimes, that's exactly what the system needs to remember.